Hi, so welcome to this episode of History Hunters. I'm here in Modesto, California at the Modesto Citizen Cemetery, and I'm here to talk about one gentleman in particular whose grave that kind of escaped me for a while. Now, a lot of you, perhaps when you hear about train robberies, you think of Frank and Jesse James, maybe the Daltons, but today I'm going to talk about John Sontag and Christopher Evans, otherwise known as Sontag and Evans, who committed at least 4 train robberies in California. They included Pixley, Goshen, Ceres, and Early Mart, maybe towns that you've never heard of. Those two are responsible for the killing of Deputy Andrew McGinnes. Sontag and Evans were tracked down to a place called Young's Cabin on Sampson's Flat in the mountains east of Fresno. On September 13th, 1892, there was a shootout between members of the Posse and the bad guys. Actually, it was more like a slaughter as the lawmen approached the cabin. The robbers opened fire, killing McGinnes and railroad detective Victor Coke Wilson. They also wounded Posse member Al Whitty. The shootout grabbed a headline in William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner entitled "A Wanton Butchery," and the article exhorted those hunting the duo should, quote, enter upon the chase with the intention of killing the bloodthirsty desperados and thus end their career of butchery, unquote. John Sontag and Christopher Evans were united in their hatred for the Southern Pacific Railroad, but for different reasons. A native of Minnesota, John Sontag came to California where he found work at the Fresno yard of the Southern Pacific Railroad. While coupling rail cars, his leg was crushed. He accused the railroad of failing to care for his on-the-job injuries. His hatred grew more intense when they refused to return him back to work after he healed. In 1889, Sontag was working on the farm of Canadian native Christopher "Chris" Evans in Visalia. Sontag found a sympathetic ear in Evans, who hated Southern Pacific for their high freight charges and how landowners were being pressured to sell their farmland for the railroad line. They decided to strike back. It's believed that their first train robbery was staged in Pixley, California on February 22, 1889. Over the next several years, several train robberies occurred in Early Mart, Visalia, Goshen, and Ceres. The two had a consistent method to their train robberies. They'd hide up their horses at the spot where they planned to stop and rob the train. The bandits would burst forth from their hiding locations and order the engineer to halt the train. They would dynamite the express car to gain access to the money on board. Finally, they would mount their waiting horses and make their getaway. After each robbery, the pair would hide in remote places in California. So by 1890, Sontag and Evans had made their way here to Modesto, where they were leasing out the Thomas Wallace Livery Stable in downtown Modesto. And on January 7th, 1891, tragedy struck when their building caught on fire, and they lost a lot of horses, and I understand that one person was killed in the fire. So a local history book has identified that the Thomas Wallace Livery Stable was located at 8th and 11th Street, but that is a mistake, seeing how those two streets are parallel and they do not intersect. Another reference indicated that Wallace lived on G Street, so I surmised that the 8th Street in the caption of the illustration was actually misread from G Street. Thus, the Wallace Empire Livery and Feed was located at 11th and G Streets, in my opinion. Based on the shadows in the drawing and knowing how the sun hits the intersection, this building could only have been located on the north side of 11th Street in the parking lot of the Stanislaus County Office of Education. And it's probably sketched in the afternoon, or it was on the west side of G Street, sketched in the morning sun. The right side of the drawing indicates that the livery yard was on a corner of an intersection. While operating the livery stable in Modesto, Sontag and Evans decided to rob the evening train in the nearby town of Ceres on September 3, 1891. At the depot there, 2 masked men jumped aboard the train, drew weapons, and instructed engineer Andrew Neff to travel another mile and stop. When the messenger refused their demands to open the door to the express car, the outlaws used 2 sticks of dynamite to blow a hole in it. 66-year-old railroad detective Lynn Harris began firing at the bandits, who quickly exchanged gunfire. Harris was seriously wounded when a bullet tore through his neck. The outlaws took off empty-handed, riding off on horses they had tied to a post near the historic Carter Vilas mansion. They left a jacket which bore a cleaner's mark that traced back to Visalia, which was Evans' hometown. Authorities first suspected and arrested Bill Dalton and Riley Dean, but later cleared both men. Harris survived the series shooting, but would later die of another shot he suffered when he foiled an attempted robbery of a Wells Fargo Express office in Boulder Creek near Santa Cruz in May 1894. Sontag and Evans left California for a time and traveled to Minnesota, where they met up with Sontag's brother, George Compton, or George Sontag, who had just been released from prison in Lincoln in 1887 after serving time for theft. On July 1, 1892, they robbed a train while riding along the Minnesota River between St. Peter and Kasota. They got very little money, but the crime aroused the attention of Pinkerton detectives. 1 month later, the trio was in California, where they robbed a train in Fresno County. Several days later, officers arrested Compton, while Sontag and Evans remained elusive for nearly a year. In August of 1892, George Compton, John Sontag, and Christopher Evans, using sticks of dynamite, held up a train near Visalia and made off with over $10,000 in gold and silver. They shot and wounded Visalia deputy George Whitty and then escaped in the deputy's buggy. On August 7, 1892, Tulare County Deputy Sheriff Oscar Beaver tracked down the criminals. While trying to apprehend both men, Evans shot and killed Sheriff Beaver. That prompted the formation of a posse. It's been said that Deputy McGinnes was tapped for the job of being in the 9-member posse because he knew Sontag and Evans. In fact, he worked here. He was a deputy in Stanislaus County, so he was familiar with the two, and they actually were proprietors at the Thomas Wallace livery stable. Right here is the grave of Andrew McGinnes. He laid down his life in the line of duty 1892, Stanislaus County Deputy Sheriff and Deputy U.S. Marshal. This plaque was dedicated in May of 2002. And over here, you will see his grave, Andrew W. McGinnes. He died September 13th, 1892. He was 42 years old, 5 months and 27 days. He was a native of Georgia. Right here is his footstone. They usually put these at the feet. The Georgia native was married and had lived in Stanislaus County, where he had served as a sheriff's deputy for 8 years. McGinnes was familiar with Sontag and Evans, as he once worked as a bill collector for them while they operated the livery stable here in Modesto. McGinnes thought that his days as a lawman were over, and he moved to San Francisco with his wife and daughter in February 1892. There he found work at the Friedlander cigar manufacturers. But the railroad desperately needed his talents as a lawman. No doubt he was lured by the promise of part of the reward money. Arresting the bad guys would also be a feather in his cap. Now, the killing of Deputy McGinnes left behind a widow by the name of Addie McGinnes. She's right here. Addie McGinnes, who was a native of the small town of Ione, which is not far from Modesto. Addie left San Francisco and came here to Modesto to bury her husband here at the Modesto Citizen Cemetery. She was paid $7,500 from the state of California for her loss. So after the murder of her husband in 1892, she moved to Stockton in the year 1900 to be exact. And she worked as an attendant in the Stockton State Insane Asylum. Now their daughter, Etta Mae McGinnes, she attended a dental school. 10 years later, finds them both in Oakland working as dermatologists. Addie apparently never remarried and died on January 4th, 1943. She's buried here next to her husband. Despite a massive manhunt and the offer of a $10,000 cash reward, Sontag and Evans eluded authorities for nearly a year. But however, one of Hearst's reporters actually got to go into the cabin where they were staying and interviewed both of them. In case you're wondering about the fate of Sontag and Evans, they were eventually caught by a new posse. On June 11th and 12th, 1893, at a place called Stone Corral, northeast of Visalia, the lawmen found the outlaws who had hid behind a manure and straw pile. After a protracted stakeout and gunfight, both men were seriously wounded. A mortally wounded John Sontag, age 33, was propped up against the bale of hay for this famous pose, laid out like some prized game that the lawman had hunted. Sontag would eventually succumb to his wounds 20 days later in Fresno. On this grave marker in the Calvary Cemetery in Fresno, you'll find an engraving of a steam train like the ones that he robbed. As for Chris Evans, he lost an eye and the use of his left arm in the gun battle and stood trial for robbery and murder. Before sentencing, possibly from the assistance of his family, he escaped the Fresno County Jail. He was on the run again, but officials tricked him into returning to Visalia on false rumors that his son was gravely ill. On February 19, 1894, almost 5 years to the day from the first robbery in Pixley, Evans finally surrendered. He spent the next 17 years as a model prisoner at Folsom State Prison. In 1911, he was released on parole and taken in by his daughter Eva at her home in Portland, Oregon. Evans died at the age of 70 in 1917 and was laid to rest in the Mount Calvary Cemetery in Portland, Oregon. As for George Cotton, he had been found guilty of a train robbery at Colas in October 1892 and was incarcerated for 15 years at Folsom State Prison. After his release, he wrote an autobiography, A Pardoned Lifer, in 1909, in which he spoke out against the danger of living outside of the law. His many lecture appearances brought him to such places as Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in his hometown he appeared at the Mankato Opera House. About 1915, Cotton produced a film called The Folly of a Life of Crime, which no known copies are known to exist today. George Cotton's last whereabouts are unknown, but he was mentioned as residing in San Francisco in the May 1929 obituary of his mother.
So the cemetery caretaker gave me a little tip about an interesting engraving on a marker over here. I want to find it and show it to you. I know what it says. It's kind of funny. I'm looking for a specific grave here. Oh, here it is. R.C. Robinson. I told everyone I was sick. I actually think he borrowed that from somebody else because I've seen that on some other tombstones. But it's still interesting, nonetheless. Here at the grave of Andrew McGinnes in Modesto, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of History Hunters.